Yeah. Yeah. Good evening, everybody, and good afternoon or good morning to guests joining from time zones west of Asia. So my name is Aditya Lolla, and I am Ember's Asia Program Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. This webinar is actually an extension of the launch of a new report from Ember, a new flagship report, actually, and it's Ember's first foray into Asia. It's Ember's first China Energy Transition Review report, and this report is published in partnership with the International Society for Energy Transition Studies, or also known as ISETS. So, why this conversation now? China is where the most of the action is at right now, as my as my colleagues kind of put in almost every report these days. So when it comes to clean energy transition, and we are also living in a world of geopolitical volatility and of course intensifying trade measures. So tariffs, de-risking, these are the kind of conversations which are reshaping supply chains. And even as energy transition is accelerating in many regions and countries, it is something which is kind of determining the way the conversations are going around right now in a geopolitical context. And in this context, China is also undoubtedly a key player that can materially influence the trajectory of global energy transition. Its scale has costs worldwide, and its market design choices, they affect how fast addition can actually become true substitution when we talk about transition. And this year's talking a little bit about this year's report. This review report offers some of Ember's hallmark data and data visualization charts and infographics. It has provincial level generation data, share data, storage, growth, curtailment, electrification, all that, all the data related to energy transition, essentially. But it also has a clear story of how it has happened within China. It kind of brings in perspectives from within China as well, and talks about how the policy landscape itself kind of evolved to enable this transition. So China is now in a phase where it is moving from merely just adding some capacity. It is actually building a flexible system, but it is not something which it took many iterations of policies and many years of tinkering with implementation, policy implementation as well. So you'll find details on some of those frictions. You'll find details on integration bottlenecks, coal lock-in risks. You'll have details on overcapacity pressures upstream, how trade measures may fragment supply chains, and all that. So at this point, I also want to broadly recognize the role of our partners, which is ISETS, as I mentioned previously. They've been a valuable partner. They helped us access key energy experts within China to understand, the transition story so far within China and unpack the policy logic and institutional dynamics behind that transition. That inside-out perspective is what we hope will add nuance beyond just the numbers. So in terms of the flow today, I'll kind of pass it on to a colleague from ISETS, who's chairman ISETS. So we are awaiting him to join our call. If not, we will directly move on to the next bit, which is the presentation. And then the presentation is going to be a two-part presentation where we're first going to talk about our data and the methodologies that we've used within while producing this report. And the second part is actual meat of the report, which has all the findings and all the charts, everything which Ember is known for. So all that you'll get that there. And the last part of today's webinar is going to be a panel discussion, which translates some of these data points into decisions and what it could mean for different parts of the world, including for China and also outside China as well. And for that, we've actually put together a stellar panel, very well-known, well-recognized, strong voices from across the region and beyond. So yeah, I think it's going to be a fun conversation for sure, with a lot of different viewpoints, but also an informative one at that. I also have to mention that we do have a specific time allotted at the end. Which for audience Q&A. So please, of course, that will be an opportunity to have some questions, but please do remember that you can add your questions anytime via the Zoom Q&A icon, which you can find on the Zoom bar. And we'll try to bring them in as we go as well. So with that said, yeah, let's get the party started. I'll pass it on to my colleagues from Ember to first give the presentation. So we have Matt Ewan, who is our energy systems energy systems analyst, and he's a bona fide data wizard within our team as well. So he'll talk a bit about the methodology, and then Dr. Mui Yang, who leads our work on China, and he's the lead author of the report. And we have Sam Butler-Sloss, who is research manager at Ember, with a lot of expertise on global electrification and anything on electrification, our go-to person as well. So with that said, I'll hand it over to Matt. Matt, please take us away.
Hi, thanks, Eddie. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Matt. I work in the data team at Ember, and I worked on some of the data and the methods for this report. Could we jump to the next slide, please? Perfect. So kind of as Adi alluded to, the goal of this report was basically to take some of the complex data and information that's out there on China's transition and turn it into clear and actionable insights for people reading it to make use of. So to that end, there were kind of three approaches that we took. So the first was to synthesize data and interpret it from quite a wide range of sources. So we've used both national statistical sources as well as kind of national industry sources. So MBS, the NEA, China Electricity Council, etc., as you can see there. And then we've supplemented that with some international, more global data sources like the IEA and like IRENA, and indeed like our own data that we gather. And what we feel we can add to this beyond the synthesization is to do the work to harmonize and make sense of it all, and put it into context. And part of putting the data into context is to call on Ember's deep connections within China. So to bring some expert perspectives from various different institutions, and contextualize all of this analysis done within the broader picture of China's energy transition. So going beyond just reporting the numbers and trying to contextualize what they mean, and how to understand them better. We kind of are able to combine these two resources of the data and the expert perspectives to produce hopefully some really new and actionable insights, and to unpack the issues in a way that will be useful to everyone watching. So both in terms of producing insights and in producing some new data, which might be useful for people to make use of. Could we go to the next slide, please? Great, thanks. So to step back, Ember's mission more broadly is to accelerate the transition to a clean, electrified future. And a big part of that mission is to create targeted data and policy insights. So the way we say this is that we turn data into action. This involves both pieces like this report, which is making sense of the data so that people can understand it, but we also do a lot of work on producing open data for others to do their own analysis on and to make that more accessible. So if we go to the next slide again. Great. We maintain at ember-energy.org/data, which is a link I'll put in the chat, so don't worry. We maintain quite a wide range of open data sets that we put together ourselves in different geographies across the energy system. So I've kind of put a few on screen there that are kind of relevant across the world. But there's many more that you can access in China, across the world, in India. And in particular, maybe of interest for this audience is that there are a couple of data sets hopefully coming soon, looking at China customs exports, and also electricity generation across different provinces. So I'll put the link in the chat, and I'll hand back over to Mui. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Matt. And morning, afternoon, everyone, for joining us today. And I think when we start scoping this report early this year, as already mentioned by my colleague Adi, and we have just one question in mind. Is China's energy transition still forging ahead or starting to stall? Why we come up with this question? And because at that time, China was facing serious challenges, from trade tensions to geopolitical complexity to the huge task of domestic economic restructuring. These pressures risk pulling policy attention to short-term issues at expenses of long-term transition goals. Because of that, we asked a simple question: is China's transition still moving ahead? And to address this question, we conduct this report, which involves three main elements: China's progress so far, the logic behind it, and what it means for the rest of the world. I will take you through the first two parts and before handing over to my colleague Sam, who will share our insights on the global implication. Let's start with the progress. I think I will show by using a few charts and some statistics, I want to demonstrate that China's transition is not slowing down and it is moving ahead. And this transition is not just about adding clean megawatt, it is structural and it is moving faster. And let's look at the supply side first. For much of the past decade, progress was often measured in megawatt in terms of clean capacity expansion. But now, China's transition is more about building the whole system, the grid, market, and storage. All these are needed to integrate and balance clean electricity at scale. And the logic behind this is quite clear. Wind and solar now supply 80% of the electricity nationwide. And if we look at some provinces like Qinghai and Gansu, they have an even higher number of wind and solar in their power grid, comparable or even about the level we've seen in Europe. But success also creates challenges. With so much variables power, flexibility becomes very important. They are important to manage wind and solar variations and hydropower's seasonal shift. And that's why the focus has shifted to system building. And if we look at the grid investment, it reached it was more than 600 billion RMB last year, and the battery storage is also booming. Last year in 2024 alone, China added 37 gigawatt of battery. This was more than the US and Europe combined. By mid-2025, battery capacity in China has already overtaken pumped hydro to become the country's largest storage sources. Now let's move on to the demand side. Electrification is rewiring how energy is used across the Chinese economy. And at the macro level, electricity's share of final energy consumption has increased from 25% in 2015 to 32% in 2023. And China has overtaken US and many major European economies in terms of the share of electricity in final energy use. And there are a few main drivers. Industry is swapping coal for electric boilers. Transport is moving electrified through EVs and electrified railways and so on. And heating is also shifting from loose coal to heat pumps and the cleaner energy sources. As the low-hanging fruit is mostly captured, China now is placing increasingly more attention on harder to abate sectors like steel, cement, and chemical, and so on. Here, heat pumps are booming, and China is already becoming the world's largest market for heat pump deployment. And let's look at the green hydrogen. And the green hydrogen production capacity has increased from almost zero to over 125,000 tons a year in just a few years' time. And now China is home to more than half of the world's total green hydrogen production capacity. And China's transition, the supply on both supply and demand side, it is also speeding up. And there are multiple trends towards this. And overachieving target has become a norm. I just give you a few examples. China's 2025 target for battery storage was achieved 2 years early. Its 2025 EV target 3 years early. Its 2030 wind and solar target was achieved 6 years ahead of schedule. In 2024, and now let's look at the even beyond this target overachievement. In 2024, clean energy sources met more than 80% of new electricity demand, up from roughly 50% in 2010s and around 15% 20 years ago. And in the first half of 2025, thermal generation actually fall by about 2%, mainly because of strong growth in wind and solar. put all these things together, fossil fuel use in China is start to peak. And if you look at the end user side, fossil consumption increased increasingly for decades in China, but plateaued at around 2015 and remain roughly at that level ever since. And we took a 12-month rolling analysis of generation data, and it shows that fossil generation is also losing steam. And this momentum is continuing. And it is not only continuing, it's actually strengthening. And if we look at the first half of 2025, we have seen record clean capacity expansion, a huge pipelines of new projects, and sustained investment in grid and batteries to back all it up. And China's story about the transition is no longer adding renewable on top of coal. Some may claim that this is simply a energy addition, not a true transition. Actually, China's transition is becoming a true transition where clean electricity is increasingly pushing fossil fuels into decline. And that brings us to a deeper question. Why? Why is China so committed to the transition? To explore this, we conduct interview with domain expert early this year. And here I'm just going to share with you some of our interpretation of the insight came out of the conversation. And the first reason is that the transition is part of a strategic reorientation to restructure the old fossil-based development model, because there seems to be an increasing realization that the old fossil-based model is becoming increasingly unsustainable. There are two main reasons. First, energy security. China has long described itself as rich in coal, short of oil, and low in gas. This is understandable because more than 70% of oil and 40% of gas are imported. And that makes coal important for ensuring energy security. Because China has large domestic coal reserves, that's true, but remember, China is also the world's largest coal consumer. And at the current consumption level, coal reserves may only last for another 30 or 40 years. And more investment in exploration and technology improvement may extend this time frame. But if we only bet future energy security on shrinking coal reserves, I think that's a very risky strategy. I think there is a growing recognition of that in China. And the second reason is that the environmental cost. The fossil fuel development model has brought with it huge environmental costs, dirty air and water, smog in major cities, and record carbon emissions. And all this environmental cost has produced social discontent and pressure the government to act. And this doesn't to say that Chinese government has not been doing anything around that. Actually, there has been lots of effort to improve environmental performance, but mainly through conventional measures like pollution control, efficiency improvement. And gradually, there seems to be a recognition that conventional measure may not be sufficient because the issue is fundamental. It is basically about the fossil-based development model. If there's no fundamental change in how we develop, then the environment issues may not be solved. And that's because of that, China is so determined to restructure its development model. And this is not only about risk, it is also about opportunities. And energy transition is viewed as a strategic lever for future competitiveness and long-term prosperity and leadership in global clean industry. Now, if the old fossil model is unsustainable and the clean energy transition offer both necessity and opportunity, the question becomes, how is China making this vision a reality? China's approach, based on our conversation with experts, is deeply pragmatic. The first element is build before break. The priority is to build up the clean system first, making sure it is stable and reliable before phasing out the old. Think of building think of it like teaching young kids to work. Stability has to come before letting go. because any misstep, like in terms of price, high electricity price or supply disruption, can undermine social confidence and disrupt the transition. And that's why in China, for coal power's role in the system is shifting. Instead of driving the whole system development, they are more like training wheels, providing backup and flexibility while clean electricity gaining strength and build confidence. The second element is systematic support, because we all know that to drive the transition, innovations are important. And in China, clean innovations are treated like seedlings, nurtured through pilot scale-ups and policy support until they are ready for the market. This helps new technology cross the so-called innovation valley of death that often stop good ideas from taking off. China's pragmatism, building first, repurposing coal, and supporting innovation, it would allow China to keep the transition on track while managing risk along the way. And this is not new, actually. It drew on license from China's own market reform experience in the 1980s and 90s, when the dual-track pricing system let market element grow first without upending stability. The same logic applies today. The growth of clean energy, EVs, and new power system build confidence, lower resistance, and gradually reshape the legacy structure, turning reform into opportunity rather than a disruption. And out of this pragmatism comes momentum. The new three, solar battery EVs, are expanding 3 times faster than the overall economy, creating jobs, investment, and more importantly, legitimacy for deeper reforms. At the same time, they drive demand for storage, smart grid, and electrification, pulling new technology into the system. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Clean growth drives deeper transition, which unlock new opportunity, which then fuel the next wave of clean growth. And China's clean transition is already reshaping the global energy landscape. Its implications are complex and vary across countries. Our aim here in this report is not to uncover everything, but to engender some debate or discussion in today's panel and beyond. Because within this shifting landscape, every country now will need to chart its own energy future. And with that, let me hand over to my colleague Sam, who will explore what does China's progress mean for the rest of the world. Sam, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Mui. So chapter 3 turns to how China's transition is reshaping the global energy landscape. Next. We focus on 3 major impacts. 1, China has made electrotech cheap and big. Number 2, this is enabling an emerging market energy leapfrog. Number 3, China acts as the pivot nation in global fossil fuel demand. To start with the first. Next. The core dynamic at the heart of the ongoing energy revolution is falling costs. Specifically, solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles are manufactured technologies that enjoy learning curves. The more we make of these technologies, the cheaper they become. And so if we take solar, since 2010, solar module prices have fallen over 90%, in which period China has been responsible for 3/4 of that manufacturing, 3/4 of that learning by doing. And now Chinese solar modules are sub 10 cents per watt, batteries sub $70 per kilowatt hour. And this is enough to profoundly change the economics of energy all over the world. Next. As impressive as China's contribution to manufacturing in the past is its sheer scale today. And here we show global solar additions in the dotted line, and with China's solar manufacturing capacity in the darker blue laid behind it. And what we see is China's manufacturing capacity is substantially larger than demand today, and remains so even in the fastest adoption IEA net zero scenario. And batteries tell a very similar story. China's battery manufacturing capacity today is double global demand last year, and remains so even in fast adoption scenarios. And the conclusion is this is a buyer's market, a consumer's market. As hardware prices keep falling, the already strong consumer case for clean power and for electric transport just keeps strengthening. Next. China has equally emerged not just as the principal manufacturer of the energy transition, but also the principal innovator. Today, it's fair to describe China just as much the science laboratory of the energy transition as its factory. And here we see in 2000, China was responsible for about 5% of global clean energy patent applications. Fast forward to the present, and that's around 75%. And in specific areas, that's even greater. In solar and wind, that's 90%. And in energy storage, that's 85%. And if we look at the corporate spend on R&D, we see Chinese corporates in the energy sector spend what the US and the EU spend combined. And in practical terms, this means EVs with longer range and faster charging, more efficient solar panels that use less materials and less space, these batteries dense enough to enter big trucks and small planes. And these technology improvements spill over borders as open markets embrace better technology. And so next, if we combine these factors, that is the falling costs, the massive supply capacity, the rapid innovation, and the conclusion is the incentives for emerging markets to embrace electrotech points only in one direction. And when incentives line up, markets move fast. Chinese-made solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles are rushing into the fast-growing global south. Developing countries, non-OECD countries, now import as many solar panels from China as the developed world, as we witness the beginning of the solar revolution in the world's Sun Belt, home to 80% of the global population. Africa is a notable case in point, and in response, home to about 40% of solar renewable potential, and at sub 10 cents per watt modules. This meaningfully changes the prospects of gaining access to electricity. And so to put the present spot prices into context, just $20 worth of solar modules could double the electricity consumption of the average sub-Saharan African person. And of course, you need the wires, you need inverters, there's other soft costs. But when the cost of the core component is as cheap as it is, many new possibilities open up. And the proof is in the adoption. Next. As recent Ember analysis showed, 25 African countries imported at least 100 megawatts of solar panels in the last year. And on the left, we see more broadly across emerging markets. It's from Brazil to Namibia, from Kenya to Chile, a number of emerging markets are leapfrogging the US in solar and wind share. If we look at solar alone, which has more live leapfrog dynamics, we see 63% of emerging markets by electricity demand has leapfrogged the US. And on the right, we see the same pattern emerging with electrification, especially in Southeast Asia. Again, the US is in blue and leapfrogs in grey, where Vietnam, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia have overtaken the US in economy-wide electrification. And just as in the beginning of last century, electricity networks rippled outwards from geographical centers of Berlin and New York, electricity-first industrialization is rippling outwards from East China to Southeast Asia. Next. So third and finally, what does this mean for global fossil fuel demand? And so we can divide the world into three buckets. The first is the OECD in dark grey, where fossil fuel demand has peaked a generation ago and has been falling ever since. The second grouping in light grey is non-OECD excluding China. And with rising energy demand, they've seen in the past as relatively steady fossil fuel demand growth. But importantly, what's emerging since 2018 is the declines in the OECD are offsetting the growth in the non-OECD. So to say that in other words, if we take China out of the global energy system, demand has been flat for 6 years. And the third line is China, which in this three-part framing is responsible for all the net growth. And as Mui's presentation showed, we're now at that historic turning point where fossil fuel demand growth in the world's largest energy-consuming economy is plateauing. If we take as a benchmark for the future, IEA's a stated policy scenario, China's demand is set to decline by 2030. And as we've also heard from Mui, given China's track record of meeting targets earlier than expected, and given this leapfrog dynamic being observed in non-OECD, this is highly likely to prove conservative. So the bottom line is, as China shifts from growth to decline in fossil fuel demand, global fossil fuel demand shifts from a plateau to structural decline. And with fossil fuels in decline, I would suggest the electrotech future will be obvious to all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt, Mui, and Sam, for laying out the findings there and sharing all the data that came out, data and the database analysis that came out of this particular research. So and it's actually a good segue to the next part of the conversation, which is the panel discussion. So here we'll try to kind of unpack some of this data and try to talk about some of the headwinds as well, which China is facing, and talk about some of the most asked about questions as well. So to begin the panel discussion, let me first introduce our panelists. It is my pleasure to introduce the four panelists that we have here. We have Lord Adair Turner, who is the chair of the Energy Transitions Commission and former chair of UK Climate Change Committee, is a leading voice in macro transition globally, macro transition pathways and also market design. We have Tim Buckley, who's director and founder of Climate Energy Finance, with 30 years of capital markets and global equity markets experience, and of course a very well-known voice on investor signals and deployment finance across Asia Pacific. Welcome, Tim. We have Ching Yun Fei, who is a project officer working on an international cooperation at Energy Foundation China. Again, very much well-known in the cooperation, international cooperation space, focusing specifically on getting politically feasible cooperation models off the ground as well. We have Putra Adiguna, who is managing director at Energy Shift Institute. He has extensive experience across both public and private spheres, especially on Southeast Asia's transition, including specific country experience in Indonesia as well, which is also one of the most important countries when it comes to conversations around transition. So thank you all for joining. So I'll maybe quickly start with an opening round of questions, and then we can kind of build the conversation with a bit more targeted prompts. So Lord Turner, so maybe I'll first turn to you. And you've just heard of Ember's findings. So maybe if you can share your reflections first, and what stuck to you, and how do you read the current trends from China in terms of cost, system design, and the momentum itself when it comes to global transition?
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to have been asked to comment on what really is an excellent report. The only way to achieve low and eventually zero emission economies is to electrify as much of the economy as possible and to decarbonize electricity supply. And on the first, as the report describes, China is now the global leader. It is electrifying transport, buildings, and now a significant amount of industry far faster than Europe or the US. On the second, as the report shows, on power decarbonization, yes, China is building new coal capacity, but it is also deploying renewables at an extraordinary rate. And as you've said, increasingly running the coal plants as flexible backup to renewable generation. And as a result, with falling capacity utilization of the coal plants and power sector emissions beginning to fall. And these developments, you quite rightly describe, are huge progress for China, but also hugely important for the rest of the world, because China has really driven the development of 5 key technologies: solar PV, wind turbines, batteries, electric vehicles, and heat pumps, which could together eliminate about 70% of global emissions. Now, all of those technologies are important, but I'd particularly like to highlight 2, solar and batteries. In both of solar and batteries, excellent Chinese companies have achieved 90% reductions in cost over the last 10 years, and also very significant improvements in performance, relentlessly higher yields for solar PV, and that's going to go on as we see the generation of perovskites coming in. We're very confident at the ETC that we'll see 35% yields by the mid-2030s. And in batteries, rising energy density and dramatically reduced charging speeds. The battery cost reductions, of course, means that EVs have now become, in China, cheaper than internal combustion engines of equivalent size and performance. And that is going to be true very soon across the whole world. And that is going to drive passenger road transport decarbonization, but also quite a lot of freight decarbonization across the world, far faster and cheaper than we thought possible just 10 years ago. But at the Energy Transition Commission, we are also convinced that solar plus batteries together is going to be a far more transformational technology than most people have realized. And we have set out why that is the case in a report we've just produced called Power Sector Decarbonization, Power Sector Transformations. We believe that in the whole of what we call the global Sun Belt, Latin America, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, where the predominant form of renewables will be sun, and the predominant energy balancing challenges is diurnal, day to night, you are going to see solar plus batteries emerging not just as part of the power system, but as the absolutely dominant part of the power system. And the technology breakthroughs and cost reductions that China has achieved are essential to that. So it is incredibly important that looking at reports like this, the world recognizes and applauds and learns from China's technological leadership, and that we embrace trade and investment flows from China so that other countries can decarbonize at low cost. But I think it's also important to recognize 3 areas where China has still more work to do if it is to play the leadership role which it must play if we are to deal with global warming. The first is more ambitious reduction targets. Yes, it is true that China's emissions seem to be close to peak. But if you take China's stated international commitments, peaking by 2030, let's assume that the emissions are flat from now to 2030, and zero by 2060, let's assume a straight line from today's level to 2060. And if you work out the area under the curve of that pathway, you will see that China's cumulative emissions on that pathway of CO2 will be 250 gigatons. And 250 gigatons is about 40% of the remaining global carbon budget to limit global warming, not to 1.5, that's impossible, but to well below 2 degrees centigrade at 1.75. And if you work out that same cumulative from now to the point of net zero for the EU, it's not 250 gigatons, it's about 45 gigatons. And for the UK, it's 4.5 gigatons. So we all have to be clear whether we achieve well below 2 degrees centigrade is going to be to a very significant extent determined what China does, almost not at all by what the UK does, and only minimally by what the EU does. And so it really is important that China, building on these amazing technological breakthroughs, commits at some stage to a faster emission reduction pathway than it has so far committed to. And there has been a promise of a new NDC to come out before COP30, which will have that more ambitious pathway. The second issue is that while it is true that coal power stations are being used flexibly, I think we have to recognize a danger that power system decarbonization will be slower than it can and should be. Because there is a danger that once you build a whole load of new coal capacity, there will be some pressure to run it in order to justify the past investment. And there are still in China flaws in power market design and electricity trading systems, which mean that you have some provinces building new coal capacity when it would make much more sense for them to be importing renewable electricity from nearby provinces, or indeed from faraway provinces with long distance HVDC lines. And despite China's global leadership in solar, wind, batteries, hydro, and nuclear, when I'm in China, I still do hear some people in the power sector, conservative voices, arguing that we will soon hit some sort of feasible limit to the share of renewables, and that therefore we will need to keep very significant coal generation even in the long term. In fact, in our ETC Power Sector Transformation Report, we show that it is possible in most countries, including China, to run power systems which get as much as 70 to 80% of their generation from intermittent renewables, and to balance supply and demand across the hours, the days, and the years. And it's really essential that in China, the argument for that radical point of view is one, and that China illustrates that in China as an example to the rest of the world. Third and finally, I think China does need an intensified strategies for the so-called hard to abate heavy industry sectors, cement, iron and steel, and chemicals, across the three of which China accounts for 50% of all global emissions in those sectors. In the case of cement and iron and steel production, Chinese emissions have now begun to fall, but that is almost entirely because of reduced construction with the property downturn. It isn't so far as a result of decarbonisation of production processes. Muyu described the significant progress which is being made in China in the decarbonisation of medium temperature industrial heat up to 400 degrees centigrade through the deployment of heat pumps. And that is a very important deployment that the rest of the world should be doing as well. But in these hard to abate sectors, we also need to deal with very high temperature industrial heat, 1,000 degrees above. And we need to deal with the chemical processes that are involved in cement production, the process emissions, and the fact that in iron and steel, we have an input of a reduction agent as well as an energy source. We do know the technologies which can decarbonize these sectors, and China is already playing a leading role in their deployment. For instance, in the development of investments in green hydrogen production, which will be extremely relevant to the new form of iron making. But I think it's important for us all globally, and this is something that I have been involved in debates in China about, to recognize that unlike in the power sector, buildings and light industries, in these heavy industry sectors, it is almost certain that even in the long run, there will be a green cost premium. It will not get cheaper to produce zero carbon steel than high carbon steel. And that means that decarbonisation will not occur without carbon pricing or regulation which has the equivalent of carbon pricing. So there needs to be a China strategy for heavy industry decarbonisation, and one pillar of that strategy should be a strengthened carbon pricing system, with prices ideally rising quite fast towards the sort of levels we see in the European Union. If we could have that in place, I'm absolutely confident that we would then see a wave of Chinese technological innovation and leadership in these hard to abate sectors, on top of the innovation in the 5 key sectors of electrification and power decarbonisation, which this report describes. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the wider discussion.
Thank you very much, Lord Turner. Thank you very much for actually laying out the challenges and contextualizing it to broader carbon budget conversation as well, and laying out the things that you view as critical things that China need to kind of look at to assume that climate leadership that it wants to. At this point, maybe I'll bring in Tim as well. Tim, you've been also looking at the markets as well. So maybe your reflections first, and maybe if you can also, in your reflections, also talk about how durable the price points, the falling price. Sam talked about buyer's market, and Lord Turner also alluded to the fact that the costs have actually fallen down by 90 or 95%. We have battery packs, modules around 8 cents a watt, battery packs somewhere around $60 per kilowatt hour, partly driven by overcapacity. But how durable are these price points, especially for Asia as well in the next 2 to 3 years? What are some of the likely repricers? So if you can give your reflections along with a bit of an intervention on that, that would be lovely.
Thanks, Adi. Firstly, I'll pick up on one of the points that Sam made in his presentation, and which then gets to the durability question you asked, which, and just to repeat, Sam quoted the stat that 75% of energy technology patents globally are now in China. It is phenomenal to have been watching China's development over the last 15 years. And the massive amount of investment in research and development is, to me, absolutely staggering. And you look at the CATL results of this first half, they spend twice as much on R&D as they reported in net profits. I mean, it's such a non-Western stock market framing where companies are absolutely investing in the long-term strategic development of the sector rather than the myopic short-termism of stock markets. And I say that as someone, as you mentioned at the start, who comes from the financial markets, and in financial markets, in stockbroking language, a month is a long time frame. And yet China is definitely investing, and Chinese companies, as well as the government, are investing in technology development, which is really not just cementing their global leadership. And I think everyone's discussions today highlight China is now the world leader in all of these clean technology sectors. They're the technology leader and the manufacturing leader, and yet they continue to accelerate the investment in technology to expand that leadership. And so at a time when the US is isolating, when the US is reverting back to its fossil fuel roots, you've got China just doubling down, going twice as fast and investing even more in cementing that technology, which then gets to the durability that you ask on the price deflation. And whilst I don't expect solar module prices to deflate over the next couple of years, they're already at selling at zero marginal cost, zero profit margins. We have seen the Chinese government starting to really rein in excessively aggressive low price competition, but ultimately there is a huge amount of capacity that China primarily has built ahead of demand growth, and there's nothing like low prices to stimulate sustained strong volume growth globally in any market that wants to take advantage of this profound technology leadership from China and low cost leadership. So I would expect prices in solar to stabilize. Batteries, who knows? I mean, we've seen prices down 50% in 2 years. But the point that was made very, very clearly here in Australia was that battery prices for utility grade batteries have dropped by 50%, but the footprint is shrinking dramatically because of the phenomenal energy density improvements. So it's not just lower cost, but it's better quality, it's lower footprints, better functionality, and it's leadership that I just think is uncatchable. And so everything we do in climate energy finance is advocate for partnering with world technology leaders, world manufacturing leaders, and trying to learn and leverage and cooperate, collaborate with China, because ultimately we want to adopt the best technologies in the world, and it's increasingly centered around China. So I would say very low prices are here to stay. Battery prices have dropped phenomenally, even if they just now stabilize for the next couple of years, along with EV prices. They're now at or below cost parity with internal combustion engines. Solar modules are so cheap that it's really the balance of system costs, and even wind turbines have come down dramatically. But in Australia, what we're really seeing is balance of system costs going up. And so even though batteries have relatively limited balance of system costs, the grid costs have doubled, trebled, and the cost of wind turbines has doubled here in Australia in the last 2 to 3 years, despite that technology improvement. So balance of system costs in countries like mine are a major problem, but I expect low prices are here to stay, and effectively China has built capacity ahead of demand growth. And if countries are stupid enough to put massive trade barriers on cheap, brilliant, world-leading technologies like China, then everyone else in the world just gets to benefit and they get left behind. Thank you.
Thanks, and that's actually a good segue to actually bring in Yunfei. Tim mentioned that China is definitely investing. Tech innovation is actually something which is going on at a rapid neck of speed. And the new buzzwords seem to be cooperation and collaboration, basically. So from your perspective, what concrete opportunities do you think China's clean energy boom open up for some of the other countries, especially on cost curves, supply chains, etc.? And what key risks do you think these countries will have to manage to capture those gains?
Thank you, Adi. Thank you, Adi, for having me. And I think this is a very meaningful question because, as you said, actually, China is reshaping this global energy manufacturing landscape. And I think every country needs to consider how to position itself in this trend. So I think the most obvious opportunity, just like what Sam elaborated in his presentation, I think first is the faster adaptation of clean energy or energy access. Because due to China's rapid growth of renewable energy, it has dramatically lowered down the cost of deployment of renewables, no matter solar, wind, or batteries, energy storage, and even grid. I mean, these can definitely help countries in other countries to faster develop their energy system and upgrade their energy system. So definitely I think this is the most direct opportunities for countries, especially developing countries, because the lower cost of deployment of renewables will help them to solve some of their financial burdens, because usually for developing countries, they always face some financing constraints, and this will help them in any way. And I think one of the other opportunity, I think beyond cost and technology, which I think might be the most important opportunity, is that China's growth or China's development on renewables actually present a new growth paradigm for developing countries. Actually, and this paradigm or this growth pathway is not go hand in hand with pollution and emission, which we usually do, or which usually China was doing. And actually, this really shows an opportunities or new thinking for those developing countries on how they can develop with their own pathway. I think this might be more important than how to develop, deploy the energy equipment or renewable energy project. So actually, when we talk about risk, actually the risk I'm concerned about the most might be the premature deindustrialization caused by the reliance on the supply chain or the dependence on the supply chain of China, because for the developing countries, when they rush to adopt the renewable energy or the clean energy technologies, they might rely on importing Chinese equipment instead of building their own manufacturing capabilities. And probably before this country really become industrialized, they have already become too mature for them to go deindustrialized. And I think this is might be a very dangerous risk for them, because this will not only affect their clean energy or energy transition course, but this will also have very long-term impact on their competitiveness and how to develop their industrial development. So I think this is my personal point on that.
Thank you, Jan. And this probably is a good place to bring in Putra as well. Putra, I think Yunfei just talked about how, to leverage China's price declines, it would be useful for countries ex-China basically to align this with developmental priorities as well, align any policies for clean energy growth. And Tim is also very eloquently put that countries will be remiss if they don't take advantage of this falling costs as well. So from your vantage point, as somebody who's been looking at Southeast Asian countries, how do you think Southeast Asian countries especially can leverage these price declines in supply chains to catalyze or accelerate green industrialization, keeping in mind that energy security and energy resilience are such a big considerations for emerging countries as well?
Yeah, thank you, Adi. I think it's a very great report from Ember to highlight this topic, because I think the debate about addition, transition about China is causing a lot of polarized debates, not just in the West and the East, as well as many parties in between, right? So I think it's very useful to have that frame. So coming back to the points that's already highlighted by the Ember team, that one of the reasons that China did the energy transition was energy security. And I think that's actually an important part, because what China did is basically redefining what can be done and redefining what energy security will look like. Now, if I'm pulling it back to Southeast Asia, for example, and Yunfei brought a very good point again about the industries, and I'll come back to that. Southeast Asia as a region has been a big energy importer for a long time, right? It has been a net oil importer since the 2000s, probably going to be a gas net importer in the next decade. It imports a lot of things. $130 billion of oil. That's the number I get from a few years ago. So I think right now we're seeing a balancing act between, of course, there's going to be some imports, but let's also bear in mind that the region is also importing so many fossil fuels within the region as well. And as we talk about the energy transitions, there's different strands of it, right? And then some people say, maybe we stop using coal, let's move to the gas as opposed to renewables. But let's bear in mind that importing gas in Southeast Asia is not exactly your gas price, in the Permian Basin in the US, right? It's a completely different ballgame, especially for emerging market. So I think the region itself, as it needs to grow, it will need to secure a long-term partnership and a stable one. And I guess what we're seeing in the United States today is actually does provide a bit of an uncomfortable position for many Southeast Asian countries, because they want to grow. They want a partner that can be stable. And I think this actually presents new opportunities to drive more green transition moving forward. Now, picking up to Yunfei's, I think, great point about the industries, that's actually one thing that also bothers me often, is that what do you do if your energy transition relies on 100% imported solar panels? That's not going to be sustainable, right? So I think let's pick up with one data point, for example. Southeast Asia as a region has been an exporting base for Chinese solar companies to markets such as the US. One data point, a lot of these countries exported 10 to 20 times more than what they do install domestically. So what happens as Donald Trump picks up all these trade barriers is that these countries will need to find a new game plan, right? Whether it's about diversifying the market, establishing more domestic consumption and so forth. So it's very important that the narrative of Southeast Asia as a manufacturer of clean energy will need to be realigned for basically building its own future rather than just being an export base to the US market, for example. What we're seeing in India is actually quite interesting. As we know, India, started to establish a lot of the solar panel production. Initially they're making a lot of panels, and now we're seeing a lot of cells import. I think this was highlighted as well in some of the Ember publication, where they're importing more and more subcomponent of the manufacturing value chain of the clean energy. And I think it's very important to firstly acknowledge that it's impossible to decouple entirely from China, but it's very likely possible that this country can have some kind of a partial domestic value chain, right? Where they establish part of the value chain, establish some part of it that they can build their own economy domestically. One thing that I think would be interesting to discuss and to understand better is that, in my view, relying solely on the market movement for Chinese companies, building their production bases in Southeast Asia is not likely a stable game plan. I would foresee that some kind of a government-to-government, diplomatic relationship will be needed as we want to go through the green transition over the long run. Because, as the saying goes, right, companies will offshore their production to the extent that it benefits them. But when your market is not really that big, I mean, India is a big country, but Southeast Asia as a whole may not be as big as an Indian solar panel installer, for example. So you will really need some kind of a government-to-government relationship as well. One thing that, let me close with this, is that as we talk about the green industrialization, there is obviously a lot of concerns about how Chinese manufactured clean technology actually is not that clean throughout the entire value chain. And I think that's a topic that we should not shy on upon, is that China, for it to become a true green leadership across the world, it needs to also improve its overseas investment standards, whether in terms of mineral extractions, manufacturing, and so forth. Because as we go through the green transition, I think it's important for us to also look through the entire value chain. I know this is not a topic that is discussed at length, but I think the clean tech side is a starting point, and now we need to start to widen the attention from China and its partner throughout the value chain. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Putra. That's an excellent place to stop. Is I think technology innovation and especially your point on overseas investment standards. I think that is something that will be very important as well. And ultimately, cooperation is about building trust as well. So yeah, points are very well taken as well. Maybe this is a good time to actually bring in Lord Turner again and talk about it from Europe's vantage point. How does this China, we've been talking more from Asia and Asia Pacific perspective so far. How does this surge intersect with industrial competitiveness and debates on decarbonization and energy security? And what balance should Europe even aim for in the current environment?
Well, thank you. At the ETC, we've just recently produced a report on global trade issues in the energy transition, addressing both some issues to do with carbon pricing and CBAM, but also these issues today to do with the dominance of China in these clean tech supply chains. And what we've tried to argue for is a really pragmatic approach to Europe, but what we're saying is also applicable to India and other countries as well in response to that leadership. One of them, I mean, the key starting point is we absolutely must not turn our back on this Chinese leadership, because that would increase the cost of the energy transition. We believe that there are some sectors where China's competitive advantage is so great, and where Europe has essentially no employment to lose in its current industrial system, where you should be quite open, and Tim said it earlier, to simply importing a Chinese product. And I would say that on solar PV, I think it would cost a fortune for the UK and Europe to try to subsidize our way to a massive solar PV manufacturing system. And even when we'd done it, the panels would not be as cheap as they were from China. So there are some sectors where I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong from saying this ecosystem of Chinese manufacturing can produce this product at an extremely low level in a way which has nothing to do with low labor cost, because I've been round solar module plants and solar cell plants in China, and there aren't many people in those factories because they're almost entirely automated and robotized factors. So there's nothing here. This isn't about labor cost arbitrage. It's about superior technology and investment. On the other hand, I think there are some sectors like batteries and EVs where Europe does have significant employment at risk in our automotive sector, and where these are much more complicated supply chains. They are, for instance, somewhat linked supply chains. The optimal place to put a battery factory is literally 500 meters away from your EV factory, so you get just-in-time delivery. They are not plug-and-play technologies in quite the same way that solar PV are. They're ones where there is an advantage of being close to a customer given the scale of the transportation cost. And all of that together says Europe probably should have a strategy to make sure that it does become a manufacturer of batteries and EVs. But in that, we argue it should be very willing to consider Chinese inward investment. And I think, picking up Putra's points about Southeast Asia, if I were a Southeast Asian country trying to make sure that I'm not entirely dependent on Chinese imports, I would be trying to work out an inward investment strategy, which can, if necessary, involve requirements to operate in a JV form. Let's be absolutely clear. Part of China's development strategy, pursued incredibly successfully in the 1990s and 2000s, was to encourage inward investment in the form sometimes as JVs in order to get technology transfer in sectors where China was behind the Western world in those technologies. We are now behind China in terms of those technologies. So yes, we should be inviting CATL and AESC and CAT and BYD and other excellent Chinese battery and EV companies to open battery and EV factories in Europe. So I think you've got to look at the different sectors and be pragmatic about where it would be possible with intelligent industrial strategy to build a local supply chain. You mustn't be religious about this. We don't want autarky. Europe has said that there are some supply chains where it would like to be no more than 50% dependent on any one supplier. We all know that any one supplier means China. And that seems to me a reasonable objective. Don't try for total autarky, but do try to develop local domestic supply chains via intelligent industrial strategy, working out in advance where there is a possibility of developing that at a reasonable cost.
Yeah, thank you, Lawton. I think even cooperation, the way cooperation, China is viewing cooperation is also kind of changing. It seems like JVs or joint ventures seems to be the preferred mode of engagement, as well as evident from some of the pilot projects which are happening in the Middle East with CATL, BYD getting into basically collaborating with utilities in the Middle East and going forward. So speaking of which, Yunfei, I'd like to kind of bring you in here. If we want to think about politically feasible cooperation models in the next 12 months or so, which pilot projects do you think could actually lead the way? Something like a co-finance green industrial park, or renewables plus storage, or data centers? And what are some of the de-risking tools that matter the most to kind of make sure that these things go forward?
Thank you. I think I will talk about from the perspective of our Energy Foundation China, because we are a philanthropy organization and we work as a bridge between China and developing countries, especially Southeast Asia. So in our eyes, we do see that there might be some window of opportunities for China and Southeast Asia, especially those countries are experiencing rapid economic growth and industrialization on industrial parks cooperation, especially the sustainable and green industrial parks, because right now China is introducing the zero carbon industrial parks in China, and it is a very comprehensive systemic approach to support this. And actually China is also paying attention to its overseas, especially in privately invested industrial parks in other countries. And China right now is trying to introduce some kind of guidelines on how to encourage the Chinese investors to invest in the green and sustainable industrial parks. So we think that might be a very good opportunity. But actually, apart from those tangible projects, if you ask me about what we will pay attention in the next 12 months, I think probably some projects or demonstration projects on capacity building between China and developing countries, China, Southeast Asia countries, might be very vital, because based on our analysis and observations, we feel like that actually the capacity gap is one of the major hinders that prevent the Southeast Asian countries away from developing better and more sound energy transition roadmaps and policy frameworks. And actually, this gap is not only in one sector or in one ministry. Actually, we think this is all around thing that we can help to with the Southeast Asian partners to get better with, not only on institutional capacity, but also on the policymaking capacity and even the workers' capacity. Because if you want to develop the industries, the clean energy industries, you have to upskill your workers. Otherwise, this will become nowhere that we can achieve. So I think from our point of view that we will pay more attention on the capacity building cooperation opportunities.
Thank you, Yunfei. And maybe taking a step back from the cooperation mechanisms and models, maybe Tim, I'll kind of put you on spot there and talk about the elephant in the room, which is the tariff, measures and the world that we are currently living in. Right. So geopolitically very volatile. There is uncertainty, which obviously increases risk premiums for a lot of investors as well. So where do you think is the greatest near-term exposure that comes from this uncertainty? Is it utility scale PV, rooftop CNI, or storage? And what can actually keep the pipelines going? What are some practical measures which countries and indeed companies can take, in your opinion?
Yeah, certainly with the American leadership, for want of a better word, the American White House, I don't think I'd call it leadership, deciding that America is going to abrogate their global leadership role of the last 50, 60 years, there is a perfect opportunity here for a redefining of the global landscape, and not a transfer of power straight from America to China, but a move to a more multipolar world. And I hope, and certainly have seen good evidence to suggest, China is starting to collaborate and cooperate a lot more strategically, whether it's the developing world, whether it's the BRICS, whether it's Europe and India and Australia. There is a very high level of goodwill there that I see that builds on Yunfei's comments about outbound investment. And I think, as you said in your earlier question, I think China is far more interested in partnerships and cooperation and outbound investment, because that's going to cement their technology leadership. It's going to allow them to use that very strategically, but it also then overcomes the point that Lolla mentioned, that Europe, for example, is pushing back on China just gutting European manufacturing capacity. And so China's saying, fine, we'll happily build factories in your country and we'll bring the best technology in the world, we'll bring the best robots in the world, and increasingly we'll employ domestic workers, domestic Spanish workers in Spain, or Turkish workers, Brazilian workers. A lot of the factories we're seeing now are actually 60, 70, 80, 90% local employees. Whereas go back to the Belt Road Initiative, one of the many problems with it was that it was very one-sided, very biased towards China's strategic development, but very much 100% Chinese workers. So I see a redefining of the geopolitical landscape, and I see China playing that very strategically and building cooperation and collaboration by outbound investment, sharing their technology leadership and their manufacturing leadership, but not just doing it with exports. They're also allowing the replacement of exports or imports into, say, Spain, with CATL partnering with Stellantis. To me, that's a perfect example of a joint venture where manufacturing the best technology, world scale, but then in country. And I suppose that then builds on the next point, which we do need to see a global race to the top. We do need to see collaboration and cooperation. We do need to see carbon pricing emerge, because ultimately we can't rely on consumers paying a green premium. We've got to remove the grey discount. At the end of the day, it's a great discount that we're competing against. You externalize your cost as a fossil fuel producer or as a steel company, and of course you're more competitive than someone who's wearing all of the costs in-house. So carbon pricing, I think, Lolla, there you touched on that. I 100% agree with you. And I see China making really good progress in that front. Like, it was beautiful to see the speech given from the Ministry of Environment last month, talking about the expansion of the EU ETS, the Chinese ETS into steel, into aluminium, into cement, and then talking about the next phase of industrial ETS, moving to 60% of the national emissions profile. And so certainly I think the conversation in China has moved quite dramatically towards thinking about, no commitment as yet, but thinking about how you then extend and price in zero emissions competitive advantages. So I'm hoping China is embracing carbon pricing, not so much because they need it. I don't think a command and control economy needs it. They've got the best technology in the world. They're already beyond price parity anyway, but other countries need it because the grey discount is just so extreme. So I'm hoping that collaboration and cooperation extends to the COP discussions, the ambition in China's 2035 target, and then a move towards discussing finance taxonomies and carbon pricing. And I would love to see nothing better than a Chinese CBAM extending the global leadership of the EU CBAM. So I'll stop my rant there. Thank you.
Not a rant at all. I think that's an excellent thought, and I think it really ties in well with what you said before as well. I think there needs to be a global race to the top, and we need, and we probably are moving towards a more multipolar world when it comes to clean energy transition. And of course, Southeast Asia is like a big, it's going to be a big player. And but yeah, obviously the energy transition journey in that region has just begun. So Putra, a quick follow-up to you as well. In terms of where Southeast Asia as a region is at, what do you think the ASEAN countries should prioritize first? Given that there is a lot of import exposure, and given that we are in a world where there is price volatility, so what should be some of the priorities for South ASEAN countries as they kind of embark on this journey, and hopefully even become a big pole when it comes to energy transition, like Tim suggests?
Yeah, thanks, Adi. I mean, picking up what Lord Turner mentioned about carbon pricing and Tim about the great discount, these topics are always sensitive in emerging markets, right? And I think what is important is that what China does project what the transition will look like for many countries, both developed and emerging markets. If we remember, 10 years or 15 years ago, when people talk about the energy transition, it's like purely a climate discussion, right? And now we can see, and just like the report that Ember is highlighting, it's about energy security. It's not just about the ripples on the surface, about the solar installation. It's about the strong current that is moving both in terms of technology, in terms of where the capital is flowing. And I think this is where it's important for emerging markets. And emerging markets here does not need to be Southeast Asia, right? We can fill in the blank, right? Sub-Saharan Africa or anybody. Because what is really important for these emerging markets to capture is that we're witnessing a global change. We're not witnessing this purely for climate reason, but there's a lot of layer after layers of reasons of why the world is moving toward clean technology. So I think the technology answers are already theirs, the options are already theirs. I think overcoming the politics of it, the near-term politics. Now, of course, we acknowledge that the whole world is not China, right? The whole world usually runs on a 4 to 5 years election cycle. So they don't have the luxury of making a 100-year plan. But I think it's important for the leadership to acknowledge that there is something that is moving, and then they need to kind of reorient themselves, whether you're a coal-producing countries like Australia or Indonesia or whomever, or you're a gas-producing countries like Malaysia. It may just be better for us to follow the green technology adoption trend rather than trying to hanging on to the past, right? And I think this is where it's going to be important for the whole discourse of the energy transition to shift. And again, China is a big element of this because what happens in Beijing casts a very strong message to many emerging markets, right? It's no longer like what happened in Brussels. What happened in Beijing really casts a different messaging. So let me stop there, Adi.
Thank you, Putra. And indeed, I think policies and politics are lagging transition itself. And I think that's one area, and it applies for all the emerging markets, like you rightly pointed out. Maybe we're coming towards the end of the webinar, so maybe we can take some questions from there. So there are a couple of questions. Maybe I'll start with the one on the EU CBAM. Tim, would you like to take that? How will the US see the EU CBAM? And then maybe Lotta, you could also probably chip in with your views as well.
I could be very sarcastic and hopeful and just say, look, who cares what the US thinks? They're going to attack everyone, starting with their allies, and then maybe they'll attack China as well. But they're attacking everyone, and it's really forcing, and put that in a positive, it does actually allow a redefining of the global landscape at enormous speed, which otherwise could have been very disruptive if China has to play by American rules. Well, no one plays by American rules because America doesn't play by their own rules anymore. And so we've actually got a redefining. So I actually am trying to be a positive aspect here. I can't, like last 2 weeks ago, we saw Prime Minister Modi standing arm in arm with President Xi. And 5 years ago, India was gravitating towards America. Now it's saying no, self-interest, energy security, and self-protection from America is the order of the day. And India is willing to partner with anyone that wants to advance mutual beneficial outcomes. We're seeing that in Australia. The conversation's changing real time. And I'm hoping, partly why I'm pointing to Lord Turner, I'm hoping Europe and China can take that leadership, because America can't tack everyone. They can pick off player by player, country by country, but if Europe's standing alongside China with global ambition on climate, then America's not, other countries will just come in, Australia will come in, India's already coming in for energy security reasons and so on. So at the moment, I'm being a bit blunt about America, but Australia as an ally of America is having to redefine our landscape. And so I just constantly remind every politician and every journalist and every presentation I give in Australia, our number one trade partner is China. China wants to invest in partnership with Australia. Let's work with countries that want to have a mutually beneficial relationship, and ignore those that are acting out of self-interest and spite. So I'm hoping the rest of the world will become the world -1 for another 3 years. And then hopefully in 4 years' time, America will come back and resume its global leadership. But it'll be in a multipolar world. It won't be as the world leader as it was. But that's history. Technology's moved on, and we're in the Asian century. Bring it on.
Bring it on, indeed. Lotta, before you answer, I'll club another question for you on heat pump manufacturing. This is from Sarah Oppenheimer. So you talked about Europe still. So you talked about Europe and how it can find a balance. So Europe is still a player in manufacturing in this technology, and there is a big issue around incentivizing demand at home, and this needs to be addressed through price rebalancing. So any thoughts on that? And then Sam, once Lord Turner gives his views, you can kind of chip in because I know you've been looking at it as well.
Well, look, I mean, the heat pump revolution is beginning to occur in Europe. It's interesting, of course, Northwest Europe, when you look at our emissions, one of the biggest issues is residential building emissions coming from the fact that we have colder winters and we use oil boilers to heat them. And not a key issue in Thailand, not a key issue in Australia, big issue in UK, big issue in Scandinavia, and the future is heat pumps. The crucial thing is to drive the application of heat pumps, as you say. We need some more initial subsidies. I think heat pumps is going to be different from EVs. EVs will very soon get to the stage where they are not only cheaper to run, but cheaper to buy up front. And that makes it easy. But I don't see a heat pump getting cheaper than a gas boiler up front. And therefore, what you've got is a micro investment for a residential home. They've got to invest in a more expensive bit of equipment up front in order to get lower costs over time. And that will require some subsidies or support, like zero interest loans or other things, to help in particular low-income people do that, because low-income people naturally have a high cost of capital. They borrow money at a high rate. So we've got to be creative about driving that. 3 very quick points on the CBAM. One, the European CBAM is going to happen because it's got to happen. Europe is committed to decarbonising totally. We have to decarbonise our hard-to-abate sectors. The hard-to-abate sectors are not going to get cheaper to produce zero carbon than high carbon. Producing iron from hydrogen is going to be more expensive from coking coal. So we have a carbon price. If we have a carbon price without a CBAM, we can decarbonize, but only in a completely hypocritical and meaningless fashion. We can shift our emissions away to somebody else. They'll go off our production register. There'll still be consumption emissions. And we can say, oh, we've decarbonized. But that would be lying to the world, and we're not going to do it. That's why we are going to have a CBAM. It's non-negotiable. Number 2, this argument is being won to a much greater extent than I thought. I've been engaged in debates in India and China for the last 5 years about the CBAM. And initially, the argument was all, you can't do this. This is protectionist. We're going to take you to the WTO. And the breakthrough for me was 2 years ago in a meeting alongside people from the European Commission, with senior policy leaders and industrialists in China. And a major Chinese a policymaker said, look, if Europe's going to have this CBAM, we've got to decarbonize our heavy industry so that we can still export to Europe. At which stage, hallelujah, that is the incentive purpose of the CBAM. And I think it's now happening in China. I think it's increasingly happening in India. And I think we are going to see the spread of carbon pricing. Number 3, on the US, the US will hate it, but Europe has got to have the guts to stick to that. And as Tim says, the relationship between the EU and China, not just the EU and China, but it will be important, I think it will be crucial. And I think what we should be looking for, ideally at COP30, is EU, China, other major countries, Brazil, India, making commitments to the decarbonization of heavy industry, which recognize that we will need carbon pricing to do that, and try to have as common framework as possible, and maybe add to it the common feature, which is where there need to be CBAMs on the route to a more universal, agreed set of carbon pricing. Why don't we devote some of the revenues of the CBAMs to helping support climate finance in the lowest income countries of the world? I would encourage the EU to unilaterally do that as a signal of the fact that the purpose of the CBAM is not to raise any revenue. The CBAM is a tariff where we want to raise no revenue whatsoever because we want the rest of the world to decarbonize its iron and its cement and chemistry as well. So in here, I think there is a very important debate between EU, China, and other major countries.
Thank you, Lotta. Sam, would you like to add your bit in 30 seconds? We're coming to the end.
Sure, yeah, I agree with the premise of Sarah's question. Heat pumps manufacturing is an area where Europe has a reasonably high share of manufacturing at about 20%. It's an area of clean technology where Chinese share of production is below 50%. So I think in Lord Turner's framing of areas to compete and areas to accept the high-performing cheap Chinese technology, heat pumps would fall in an area for Europe to compete.
Yeah, nice and crisp. Thanks so much, Sam. So we are coming to the end of the time, so maybe we can wrap it up there. But like I said in the beginning, this is just this is like a conversation starter. This is the most cliched thing everybody says at the end of a webinar. This is the beginning of the conversation, but it is the beginning of the conversation because we are in a place where energy transition itself is kind of it almost seems like it's entering a new phase globally, and this conversation kind of shows that the economics are shifting fast, the geopolitics are shifting fast, and so are the market opportunities. So the job is now for the governments to double down on market creation for to actually turn some of the low hardware costs into firm bankable capacity. That's the big takeaway from me as well. And then also about collaboration and cooperation. The new, I think there is a need to innovate in terms of cooperation as well, and there is a space to do that as well. So with that said, yeah, we welcome everybody to engage on these topics separately as well. On behalf of Ember and ISETS, I'm Aditya Lolla. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the panel for taking time out and making this conversation a fun one, at least for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.